Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Bill Wright, the head of global government affairs at the company Elastic, about cyber threats facing the U.S., whether AI is helping adversaries improve their cyber attack capabilities, and if the government shutdown has made America more vulnerable. And then we break down the dueling moves by the U.S. and Russia on nuclear tests, the possibility of American military strikes on Venezuela, and we talk about Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's major acquisition reform speech. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times. I'm joined as always by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. A packed show this week on the post-election edition of the Threat Status Podcast. Politics always in the background, of course, but here in the show this week, we're going to drill into cybersecurity and specifically whether the federal government shutdown is making us more vulnerable to cyber attack. Bill Wright from the company Elastic will help us break all of that down in just a few minutes. But before we get to that, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here with you for another week. There are several things I'm tracking, but I'm really going to focus on one thing, which was the announcement in recent days by Russian President Vladimir Putin that he has ordered his internal security council to submit proposals for a possible resumption of nuclear weapons tests by Russia. Putin made this announcement on November 5 as a specific response to a statement that President Trump made on October 29 on his Truth Social platform, in which Trump announced that he had instructed the Pentagon to, quote, start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis as Russia and China, end quote. That Trump statement, Ben, triggered all kinds of speculation and implications and hand-wringing in national security circles. And this is a somewhat shocking situation. We're trying in the Threat Status Daily newsletter to unpack why this surge in great power nuclear weapons posturing is suddenly happening right now. Trump's announcement sort of came out of nowhere. The president said the U.S. needed to start testing nukes again after a 33-year hiatus because adversaries, specifically China and Russia, are already resuming nuclear tests that violate the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that China, the U.S., and Russia and others have adhered to over the years, even though none of them have ever actually ratified that treaty. There's a lot of evidence out there that China especially has spent recent years building up its nuclear weapons stockpile, but there are questions about whether China has actually carried out any nuclear bomb tests. Interestingly, Ben, Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Tom Cotton, he's a Republican, weighed in on this in recent days, saying publicly that CIA Director John Ratcliffe, a Trump appointee, had personally confirmed to him that both Russia and China have, in fact, conducted, quote, supercritical nuclear weapons tests in excess of the U.S. zero-yield standard, end quote, in recent years. I could go on here trying to read between the lines of what that actually means or refers to, but let's focus on just a couple of big points, Ben. We're in an era of great power competition between the U.S. and China mainly, with Russia, a smaller power, also playing a major role. And now suddenly we're seeing the emergence of very Cold War style posturing on the nuclear weapons issue, specifically between Russia and the United States. Haven't heard a lot from Xi Jinping on this. But how do we get to this? There's really one key thing to consider, in my view, and that is the great uncertainty that there is over the so-called New START Treaty. That's the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. This is the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty that exists between the U.S. and Russia, and it it is set to expire in about 3 months, on February 5, to be exact. This New START treaty was signed back in 2010. It was first slated to expire in 2021, but a total breakdown in U.S. Russia relations saw American and Russian officials kick negotiations on it down the road by extending it to early 2026. The aspect that matters here, Ben, is that China has never been a signatory to the START treaty. And this past 15 years or so have seen China speed ahead with its nuclear arsenal buildup. So, my read on what's happening now is that Trump wants there to be a new major nuclear non-proliferation negotiation and potentially a new treaty with both Russia and China. And the way that he's bringing it up is by making this sudden public pronouncement, hey, the U.S. is going to start testing. And then we can watch how Russia and China respond to that announcement. And as scary as all this is, the big question is whether anybody actually will carry out a major test, or is this all just posturing to set the stage for Trump, Xi Jinping, or Putin to come forward and call for a major treaty negotiation of some kind? We're tracking that in threat status, Ben. I feel like we're going to be discussing it here a whole bunch on the podcast over the months ahead.
Yeah, and questions, of course, as I know you've pointed out in the newsletter in recent days, the threat status newsletter, about are we talking about actual explosions? Are we talking about bombs going off, whether it's above ground or underground? That's a key question that we're trying to figure out right now, too. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, of course, says that these nuclear tests are necessary for deterrence. He told friend of the show, Washington Times national security correspondent Bill Gertz, that recently while Bill was traveling with the secretary in the Pacific. And I want to mention, while we're on the topic of the Secretary Hegseth guy, he has a major speech coming up tomorrow on Friday, as we record this on Thursday, to defense industry leaders about Pentagon acquisition reform. Now this speech is happening Friday afternoon, as I said. So this podcast will only have been live for 8 or 9 hours before the address itself takes place. So we don't need to spend a whole lot of time here speculating about what exactly he'll say, because you'll be able to hear it for yourself Friday afternoon. But a few things we do know, Guy, at least according to a leaked memo first reported by Politico this week, and that is that Secretary Hegseth is pushing speed. In fact, according to this memo, companies could get, quote, incentive compensation, unquote, if they deliver weapons and systems to warfighters on time. In other words, more money if they deliver on budget and on time, which has, of course, been a huge problem for any number of big ticket Pentagon programs and contracts over the years. There will also reportedly be new scorecards used to grade prototype development, operational capability, production ramps, and schedules. So a better way for the Pentagon to keep track of how its defense industry partners are doing in any given number of areas. So this could be the long-awaited acquisition reform that the defense industry has said it wants to see. We've had plenty of guests on this show talking about wanting to see defense acquisition reform. Though, in some ways, I wonder, Guy, if it's going to put more pressure on them. Our defense companies, especially some of the primes, perhaps, that are used to multi-year and even multi-decade programs that, let's be honest, sometimes do go over budget. Are they going to be able to adjust quickly to this new reality, if that is in fact what the defense secretary proposes? We'll see. And I'm also interested in how he approaches this speech from a personal point of view, as his last major address was the very controversial September 30th speech to generals and admirals at Quantico. Guy, we're both pretty plugged into the defense industry. What are you hearing from your sources about what we should expect to see on Friday?
Everybody, I'm trying to figure out which representatives from which major defense companies are going to be there. We'll probably have some light on that in next week's newsletter on Monday. I know you're going to be covering the speech, Ben, but what I think is interesting is that Army Secretary Dan Driscoll gave a speech at the opening of the AUSA 2025 conference, which was last month. This is the Association of the U.S. Army annual. It's basically a massive weapons show that happens in Washington, D.C. every year. The Army Secretary essentially slammed the defense acquisition system in a really aggressive speech, saying that it prioritizes the desires of government bureaucrats and defense lobbyists over the needs of American soldiers. So, yes, this is something discussed across the U.S. defense industrial base, all the companies involved in that. So I would like to see Secretary Hegseth announce something coherent and tangible. And it sounds like that could be what's going to happen. So I'm not going to, I don't know exactly I read the leaked memo the same way that you did. We've written about it this week. It's going to be interesting to see from all sides, especially the optic you point out, which is, how's he going to handle this? He's come under a lot of fire for his press restrictions stuff. He's coming off a pretty successful trip to the Indo-Pacific where he went to several nations. We'll see how it goes, and we'll see how the media covers it. Now that mainstream news outlets, the Washington Times included, have refused to sign these press coverage rules that Secretary Hegseth has demanded from everybody. So this is going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's certainly the defense secretary's style, because I'm sure there will be some folks who said, did you need to give a big high-profile speech announcing all this stuff, or could this have been done, more privately in a memo, as it maybe traditionally would have been with past defense secretaries? But this is the way that he operates, and so we'll see how this speech unfolds on Friday. Speaking of the U.S. military, we have to talk for a minute about the potential for strikes, U.S. strikes against Venezuela. Now, last week on the show, we raised this idea with retired Air Force General Charlie Dunlop of Duke University Law School, specifically about the legalities around U.S. military action against the government of President Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, and how there's a higher legal bar, a much higher legal bar, that should be met to justify this. In other words, this isn't the same legal argument the U.S. has been using to justify its strikes against alleged drug boats off the coast of Central and South America, or at least it shouldn't be the same argument, according to scholars like General Dunlop, who rightly point out that action against a sovereign government is very, very different than strikes against alleged drug smuggling boats at sea. There's a real military buildup happening just in real time right now as we record this. This week, the White House reactivated a closed Cold War era military base in Puerto Rico and deployed F-35 fighters, helicopters, other assets there. A naval warship recently docked in Trinidad for drills. The U.S. aircraft carrier USS Gerald Ford, its strike group, is expected to arrive in the Caribbean next week. The U.S. already has other military assets it's ramped up in recent months in that region. Friend of the show, Mark Cancian of the Center for Strategic International Studies, put out a very helpful chart this week that shows right now, according to data he's seen, some from publicly available sources, that right now the U.S. has at least 115 Tomahawk missiles in that theater, with another 71 Tomahawks coming aboard the Gerald Ford carrier group next week. For context, we had 135 Tomahawk missiles in the region when the U.S. began bombing Houthi targets in Yemen. We had 288 in theater during the first Gulf War. So all that is to say, this seems to point to action. While President Trump is reportedly reluctant to order it, it's just really striking that we're moving this kind of firepower into the region. It's getting increasingly difficult for me to believe that we're not going to do something with it once it's there. So, and Mark Cancian, I don't think he'll mind me saying this, because he mentioned it in a public LinkedIn post. He said his guess right now is on a missile strike against Venezuela in 2 weeks, within 2 weeks. So will that be against alleged, drug cartel facilities? Are we talking about actual Venezuelan government targets being hit by U.S. Tomahawk missiles? Of course, we don't know. And it's worth noting that the Senate is expected to vote today, Thursday, on a resolution to block U.S. strikes in Venezuela that has at least some small level of bipartisan support. So we'll see where that angle goes as well. One last thing, Guy, before we move on quickly, when we're talking about military action, we also have to mention that President Trump has raised the possibility of military strikes in Nigeria, halfway around the world, of course, from Venezuela, in response to what Trump says is a failure of the Nigerian government to protect Christians there, some of whom are being killed. I'll have a deep dive coming soon in the Washington Times about the U.S. military posture across Africa and what its goals actually are, to the extent that we know. But for now, just keep this in mind. And we talk about this on the show a lot, but it's always worth thinking about. Under President Trump, we're routinely striking terrorist targets in Somalia. We operated an aggressive campaign against the Houthis in Yemen. President Trump approved strikes against nuclear facilities in Iran. We're blowing up alleged drug boats in the Caribbean. We could soon strike Venezuela directly. So for a president whose foreign policy was built on stopping forever wars and not getting the U.S. bogged down in foreign conflicts, it's pretty notable to stop and think about all of the new theaters and new conflicts, to whatever limited degree they've taken place, new U.S. military action abroad that's taken place over just the past 10 months. We are joined now by Bill Wright, the head of global government affairs at the company Elastic. Bill previously held several high-profile posts across the federal government, including in the National Counterterrorism Center in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, among others. Bill, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Hey, Ben and Guy, thanks for having me. I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller, so appreciate the opportunity here.
Of course, it's a pleasure to have you here. Can you, if you would, rather than me try to do it, can you give our listeners just a quick 1 or 2 minute explanation of what your company Elastic actually does?
Yeah, you bet. So, at its core, Elastic is the search AI company. So, what that really means is that we help organizations of all size take that massive, staggering amounts of data, especially that messy, unstructured data that is growing so quickly and that makes up most of the digital world, and then helps organizations find the right answers so that they can take action. So, think of it as the power of search, but for an entire enterprise's security, operational, and sort of mission data. In the public sector, which is where I spend a lot of time, this is incredibly powerful. So we work extensively with agencies. So, think Army, Air Force, DHS, CISA itself. In fact, CISA is the nation, our cyber defense agency is standardized on the Elastic platform. So we help them with everything from finding that needle in the haystack piece of data to stop a sophisticated cyber attack, to just ensuring their own systems are resilient and running well. So very, very powerful company that not a lot of people have heard about yet.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to get into some cybersecurity and cyber threats right now. I know you're eager to talk about the PACT Act, Protecting Americans from Cyber Threats Reauthorization legislation, introduced a few weeks ago by Senators Gary Peters and Mike Rounds. This bill would reauthorize a law that essentially provides a framework in which private companies can voluntarily share cybersecurity threat indicators, malware signatures, software vulnerabilities, malicious IP addresses with the Department of Homeland Security. The current bill, as I understand it, expired on September 30th, so that framework, technically as of today, isn't in place. Why is this important as you see it, Bill? And can you explain why we need to have a law in place to do this in the first place? Can't companies just continue to voluntarily share this information with the government, even without this legal framework in place?
Yeah, I think one would think, it truly is one of sort of the last truly bipartisan issues out there. It's been on the books for over a decade, I believe, and it allows companies like us and thousands of others to share those technical indicators of an attack. So think malware signatures, malicious IP addresses, new software vulnerabilities that we're seeing in the wild with CISA. So then CISA can then warn agencies and other companies before the attack spreads. And that's not a theoretical problem right now. The real world data right now, right after the government shutdown, I was just reading. Dark reading reported that the media trust showing that cyber attacks targeting federal employees surged 85%, or targeting agencies. And we're not talking about low-level spam here. We're talking about targeted digital attacks coming through websites, apps, ads. They were on track to hit $550 million attacks. So the question as to why we need this kind of thing. The central challenge in cybersecurity is a problem around information silos. So let's say Elastic here sees one piece of an attack, a novel malware signature or something like that. Another vendor sees another piece of it. CISA and DHS, of course, have their own unique purview. Combining that all, putting together the pieces of the puzzle is really what provides us that collective defense. So without the legal protections for companies like Elastic, I'm telling you, there's a lot of goodwill among companies, but we also have to have some sort of legal framework. We've really gone from a default share position to a default, hey, let's get legal review before we move on this. And just that little bit of slowdown, that little bit of critical delay, even if it's just hours, is really a lifetime in cybersecurity. So when we get clearance from our legal team, that attack has probably already moved on and promulgated elsewhere.
Okay. Well, we're going to get into information silos here in just a minute. I know Guy has a question specifically around all the different sectors of the U.S. economy that are a part of protecting against cyber threats right now and how complicated and difficult a job that can become. But you mentioned the government shutdown. Let me drill into that for just a second. Can you walk us through what that means for cybersecurity? Obviously, there are still a lot of essential workers throughout the government, still working on cybersecurity. Cyber Command is still operational, for example. But are we more vulnerable right now? Are there specific vulnerabilities that have been opened up because of the government shutdown, and what are they?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say a couple things. First off, our adversaries read the news also. They understand that there's a shutdown, understand that there are furloughs in place, probably understand that some of the legal protections around sharing cybersecurity information is also lapsed. So to say that they don't recognize an opportunity when they see it is probably pretty naive.
Bill, it's Guy Taylor. In going back to the PACT Act, in his statement announcing it, Senator Peters said that the framework in which the private sector shares threat indicators with the government, quote, help defend critical networks at our hospitals, financial systems, and energy grids from cyber attacks for a decade. So the medical sector, the financial sector, and the energy sector, they're all really different. I'm wondering, is one more vulnerable to cyber attacks than the others? That's one question. And then within the context of that, to what degree are there big overarching principles to guide cooperation between specific industries and government when it comes to cyber threats? Is this really a rocket science situation, or is it more like just follow these basic guidelines?
Yeah, good question. On your first one, when you look at various critical infrastructure groupings, certainly some are maybe less sophisticated in their cyber protections than others. There's probably a hierarchy there. I can tell you that the financial services sector, for instance, is quite well protected and very sophisticated. Then you go down to, let's just say, your basic water plant, probably far less sophisticated in their cybersecurity protections, and probably need a little bit more help around that. And then other critical infrastructure out there probably run the gamut, with energy probably on the more sophisticated side, healthcare probably somewhere around in the middle. And a lot of that is based on the resources and sophistication that they have. But the important part around this is the collective defense, where all private sector companies and government are sharing information, trying to break down those silos of information sharing so they can get a comprehensive picture and create a good collective defense around that. And I'm sorry, your secondary question there, Guy.
In the with regard to the principles that would guide cooperation between specific industries on cybersecurity, or is this like really specific rocket science like techniques, or are we really talking about basic, broad principles of don't leave your laptop open on the train type of thing?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think I would say it's more on the elementary scale there. It's good cyber hygiene. It's good information sharing. I guess to go back a little bit, Guy, information sharing obviously has gone on for a very long time. Even before we had some of the legal frameworks in place. What I would say is that the legal frameworks providing the protections has sort of greased the wheels there, have facilitated things. I can tell you, at prior jobs when I was either in the government or with some of the cybersecurity companies I worked with before this, so much of the information sharing was contingent on personal relationships that you may have had in the government. And while that worked excellent for some companies that had those connections into agencies, the trusted relationship was working well. There are a lot of companies seeing a lot of different things across the critical infrastructure field that were not providing that information because they didn't have the connections there, or they had a legal team that was nervous. A whole number of reasons, and so this sort of information sharing, I think, has been very positive.
Well, I have another. I want to pivot to another kind of pet issue of mine, because Paul Nakasone kind of blew the lid off of it, the former NSA director, a few years ago. And it's this idea of living off the land cyber threats. Do you worry that we being, U.S. critical infrastructure are already compromised in some ways? And this idea that our existing critical infrastructure system is not only vulnerable to attack, but could already be compromised with software written into it.
Yeah, I mean, so great point. And, I can't speak with definite understanding here, but I agree with you that certainly some of the living off the land vulnerabilities over the years have allowed adversaries to probably infiltrate and at least stage across our critical infrastructure. I don't know to what extent. One thing I would say is that it's very difficult to defend against what you can't see. That's why I think observability is such an important part, so that you can mitigate these instances a little bit quicker. So again, getting back to the fact that data is the key around here, and we tend to see so many problems at Elastic as data problems, and I think that is another one.
Bill, I want to ask you kind of a very blunt question about this, because as we said at the outset, you used to work in the government, including, I believe, with the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. I'm just wondering, how hard is it for Congress, for legislators and their staffs to keep up with the rapid pace of cyber threats? I mean, we're talking about incredibly complicated, fast-moving stuff, software that's changing on a daily basis, malware signatures, as we said earlier, vulnerabilities, IP addresses. Congress moves pretty slowly on this, and a lot of its members are, let's be honest, pretty old. So I just wonder, does that constrain us in some way? Do you think that we being the United States of America and our legislative body are in a position to truly grasp how all of this stuff works, and is the system designed in a way to actually to address problems before they become significant issues?
Yeah, great question, Ben. I think if there's one truism in Washington, it's that technology, and in this case, cyber threats, is always going to move faster than policy. I think that then leads to having good public-private partnerships like we have currently. Having the private sector do what they do best, and that is innovate and move increasingly better technology in order to keep up with this growing cyber threat. There's no doubt about it that Congress, maybe not the best place to legislate a lot of this stuff, but that is why we need to be, partnering with Congress best we can. I was just up in Senate Homeland and House Homeland later last week, discussing a lot of these issues, and both committees are very eager to talk to the tech community and learn more about emerging technology and where we're seeing threats. So definitely an area where public-private partnership's going to continue to play a big role. And then on Congress's part, I guess I would say that when we do enact laws, that law needs to be well thought out, and then have some flexibility to to evolve when the threats evolve or when technology evolves.
Bill, we got almost 15 minutes here, and we haven't had a question about really specifically about artificial intelligence. So we got to do that. We've reported at Threat Status recently about how adversaries such as China could use AI, or perhaps already are, to improve their ability to conduct cyber attacks. How does AI potentially change the game? How could it make cyber attacks more dangerous, or make our adversaries more capable in that space?
Yeah, I think a number of ways. First off, I think that on the adversary side, AI could sort of democratize a lot of the threats. It can lower the threshold of somebody getting into the threat game, which obviously is quite dangerous. But it's also a double-edged sword. I think it is helping our cyber protections as well. It's allowing our high-level cybersecurity professionals to focus on the really high, sort of high-level threats, and allow for some of those lower-level actions to be handled by AI. So, I think we're going to see both sides of the coin. I personally think, that AI is going to ultimately favor the defender. I think that AI is so much driven on data, and good data at that, that I think the defender might have, in the long run, might have a leg up. I know that's not a popular opinion, but I think that's the case.
Bill Wright, head of global government affairs at Elastic. Thanks so much for coming on the Threat Status podcast, Bill.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Guy. Appreciate it.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I will each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world, that could be impacting U.S. national security right now this week as you all listen to the show. And my threat of the week is indeed domestic, and it's a reduction in flights across the country amid the federal government shutdown. The FAA is announcing today, Thursday, a list of 40 high-volume airports where it's going to reduce flights by 10% due to staffing shortages caused by the government shutdown. Atlanta, New York, LA, DC. The FAA says it's a safety issue. Air traffic controllers have been working without pay since the shutdown began more than a month ago. A lot of them working 6 days a week with mandatory overtime. Some apparently have stopped showing up. I guess it's hard to blame them when they're not getting paid, but this is a threat right now for a number of reasons, not to mention we've had some high-profile safety incidents at airports, including the D.C. area recently, and the travel itself is about to become a disaster in this country. We've already heard horror stories about delays, hours-long waits on the tarmac, and a 10% reduction in flights across the country is just going to make that drastically worse. So hopefully this could be a catalyst for both sides of the aisle to get together and make a deal to reopen the government, because I think there's a chance that we're on the verge here of scenes of chaos and potential safety concerns at American airports, the likes of which we haven't seen on this scale in a long time.
It's an interesting, Ben. There's a kind of background piece of all of this is that the contract award for a major FAA technology overhaul hasn't come out as of our taping this. The companies Parsons and Peraton have been in a kind of pitched battle bidding for this $12.5 billion contract that the funding for which was put in President Trump's big, beautiful bill that was signed earlier this year. So that's like another layer to all of this, is the private contracting side of what's actually going to happen with the FAA going forward. I've had a couple of different industry sources suggest to me that that contract would have been awarded by now had it not been for the shutdown. So we're watching to see whether that gets awarded. For my threat of the week, Ben, I'm going back to the nuclear non-proliferation issue. While I'm hopeful that this posturing we're seeing from Trump and Putin will lead to new treaty negotiations, my threat is that the world actually could suddenly be looking at a major nuclear bomb test of some kind by the US, by China, or by Russia. And that's just potentially very dangerous, Ben, because it could result in a kind of escalation that we haven't seen in literally decades. We're talking about nuclear bombs. It's scary stuff, and that's my threat of the week.
It's something that's all of a sudden, just here in a matter of a week or two, has just jumped very much to the forefront, and the front pages, rightfully so, in terms of national security discussions, not only in the U.S., but around the world, for sure. So thank you for that, and a huge thanks once again to Bill Wright from Elastic for that great conversation about cyber security. A big thanks to all of you, of course, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.